Главная проблема.
The main problem is that the United States and its NATO allies are not prepared under any guise for any reason, which we have discussed and analyzed over and over again, to meet our key demands to NATO.
Moscow expresses frustration over security talks with the United States and its allies as tension continues over Russian troops along its border with Ukraine. Hello, I'm Andrij, and this is The Heat. Poland's foreign minister said on Thursday that Europe was closer to war than at any time in the last 30 years. Meanwhile, for his part, Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said talks had reached a dead end, with no reason to sit down again in the coming days to restart the same discussions. These bleak assessments come as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe met in Vienna, hoping to push Russia and the West towards a diplomatic solution to the tension along Ukraine's border. CGTN's Natalie Carney has more in this report.
Yes, the meetings here in Vienna concluded with no real breakthrough, as unfortunately we also saw with meetings in Geneva and in Brussels earlier on this week. The new chairman of the OSCE, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Rao, did say that the OSCE is committed to playing a role in addressing the security challenges of Eastern Europe. He says that more open dialogue is required and all parties need to bring to the table initiatives aimed at reaching mutual understanding and easing tensions. He personally is also very interested in reinvigorating the Helsinki principles with full conformity of international law, believing this is one of the solutions for the current tensions and standoffs in the east of Ukraine. The issue is, how much can the OSCE really do in bringing down the standoff that we're currently seeing, while the OSCE works to create a more open and transparent and secure environment within the sort of political and military arenas of all its 57 members. It simply cannot deliver the demands that Russia is asking for. For instance, Russia does not want the Ukraine to enter NATO. It also wants all NATO troops out of Eastern Europe, as well as U.S. nuclear missiles. They want it out of the entire continent, of Europe. All requests and demands that the OSCE cannot provide. Putin himself, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has called NATO's expansion to Ukraine and other ex-Soviet states a red line and is demanding binding guarantees on this particular issue. While the OSCE security monitoring mission in Ukraine can provide the fine details of what is happening on the ground, such as ceasefire violations on both sides of the conflict, they are saying that their monitoring mission is being restricted to some degree. So even there, we are not getting the full picture of what is happening on the front line in eastern Ukraine. But the information provided by the SMM certainly does allow for more frank and more open negotiations, which is thereby hoped could bring about more stability in this ongoing conflict that we are seeing. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Vienna.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University. Andrij Dobriansky heads UN affairs for the Ukrainian World Congress. Also with us is Yuval Weber. He focuses on Russian military and political strategy at Marine Corps University and is a research assistant professor at Texas A&M. And Klaus Laris is a European affairs analyst and professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Klaus Laris, Poland's foreign minister, used some very alarming language. He said Europe is closer to war than at any other time in the last 30 years. What do you make of that assessment?
Well, it's indeed very dramatic language, and I'm not sure it's correct, and of course I don't hope it's correct.
I think the dialogue which has started this week at 3 different locations should definitely continue in next week and the week after until some sort of concession has been made by both sides, until a compromise has been found. When you really think about it, the main requirement of the Russians, of Putin, is really that Ukraine should not join NATO. And NATO doesn't actually want Ukraine to join NATO, but they don't want to put that down as an ironclad guarantee and give the Russians a document about it. So, because both sides are talking about something which is really not on the horizon at all. So it shouldn't be too difficult to find some sort of compromise, like a declaration, like an assurance, which is perhaps not a legal treaty, but will still be sufficient to clarify to Putin that Ukraine and Georgia will not join NATO for the really long-term future. And I think it can't be impossible to find such a solution.
Klaus, do you think there is a recognition within NATO that Russia has legitimate security concerns?
No, I don't think so. I think what is recognized is that Russia, of course, is very close linguistic, historical, cultural links with Ukraine. But on the other hand, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It became the sovereign after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that has been reconfirmed, including by Russia, several times in the 1990s. And Ukraine is a sovereign country. So the Russians cannot really determine Ukraine's fate. On the other hand, it is, of course, natural that Russia would like to resurrect its sphere of influence of the Cold War, and that Putin is thinking in kind of almost Soviet terms, and therefore a compromise should be found. We also have to recognize that Ukraine has always been quite pro-Russian, but since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the kind of semi-occupation of Russia of the Donbass and other Eastern Ukrainian territories, Ukraine has actually increasingly moved towards the West. So there is fear of Russia, and Russia cannot bring about friendship with Ukraine by imposing a threat on and fear on Ukraine. It needs to be the other way around. And I think no one is opposed to friendship between Russia and Ukraine, but it should not be enforced friendship.
Anton Fedyashin, as Klaus Laris told us, that was indeed a dramatic statement from the Polish foreign minister, alarming in certain respects, saying that Europe is closer to war than at any other time in the last 30 years. But the Russians now see no further purpose in continuing negotiations. We heard the deputy foreign minister say that we've reached something of a dead end because their main demand has not been met. Do you think this is the end of this current round of negotiations, or is this some kind of strategic break by the Russians?
I think this is rhetoric and posturing on both sides. First of all, Europe has been closer towards, been in war during the 1990s in Yugoslavia. So, it depends on how you define Europe, and you certainly can't cut the Balkans off from it. So this was rhetoric on the part of the Poles who are now in charge of the OSCE, or chairing, I should say, the OSCE. And the Russians are also posturing, in other words, communicating that their patience is at an end. Listen, the assurances by NATO that it is strictly a defensive alliance is both true and at the same time not entirely convincing. Look, there's no such thing as a defensive alliance. All military alliances can be both defensive and offensive, just like any gun can both be defensive and offensive. If anyone walks into a gun store in the United States and says, listen, I want to buy a weapon for defensive purposes only, so let's skip the background check and, let's not register it because I promise I won't use it in any other way. That's not going to fly. We know that NATO has conducted operations that were not defensive in Yugoslavia in 1999, illegally, and in Libya in 2015. And it has justified those operations in one way, which is acceptable for some. And then from the strictly legal, international legal point of view, they were also illegal. And Russia's done illegal operations itself. So I think we're at an impasse, and I think the next few days will let us know if there are any incremental steps that both sides can begin to make towards preventing anything that is irreparable.
But Anton, you do think that the two sides will get back to the negotiating table?
I'm pretty certain that they will. I think that the sharp edges will remain, and they will be brought up again. One of the things that convinces me that not all is lost is that the foreign ministers have not spoken. As a matter of fact, Sergei Lavrov has been conspicuously absent in terms of being directly involved in these conversations. And so he's the sort of the good cop of the Russian side. So we'll see what happens. But I think that the Russians are using the breakdown, or will use the breakdown of these talks, also sort of as a legitimizing factor in whatever they choose to do next, which, by the way, I don't believe will be a full invasion of Ukraine, but it may be military actions against NATO actions that they may consider particularly dangerous. Either way, it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
Yuval Weber, it's been a week of very intense diplomacy. The Russians met initially with the United States delegation, then they met with NATO, and now they have met with the OSCE. This is how the deputy Russian foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, summed up this week of intense diplomacy. He, of course, led the Russian delegation. Let's listen.
The main problem is that the United States and its NATO allies are not prepared under any guise for any reason, which we have discussed and analyzed over and over again, to meet our key demands to NATO. The demands are non-proliferation of NATO, the rollback of alliance infrastructure and returning to its 1997 borders, and of course, on the issue of legally binding guarantees on the non-deployment of weapon systems in the immediate vicinity of our borders. We can no longer retreat. We can already see that there will be other measures, other actions against our opponents if they do not take into account our demands and our needs in the end.
So, Yuval, the two sides are sticking to their positions on this. Where do you see this going?
Well, it can go in several directions, and I think, as Anton said a moment ago, the larger underlying issue here is that the end of the Cold War from 1989 all the way to the present was a period of weakness, both for relative weakness for the Soviet Union and absolute weakness for the Russian Federation in the immediate years following the end of the Soviet Union. All the security architecture of Europe during that time was locked in. And now that Russia is no longer as weak as it was, it wants to revise that entire European and international security architecture, not only to have very specific demands, the stuff that Deputy Minister Ryabkov was describing a moment ago, but also to legitimize the tactics that Russia has used over the last number of years. And those are ultimately the things that are not acceptable to NATO, to Europeans, to the United States. So it can go in several directions. One, the peaceful path is that they come together and they keep talking. And as the first guest, Dr. Lares, described, there could be some sort of formula that acknowledges the reality of the situation without giving too much away from basically the NATO side. Because one of the requirements that NATO has is that no state can enter with a territorial dispute. So they could just reaffirm what their membership criteria already are and just use that as a mechanism to try and reassure the Russian side. But at the same time, the Russians are not giving anything in terms of their diplomatic demands. And so if they go towards the path of conflict, it could be, maximum would be, full invasion of Ukraine, which would be, aerial destruction of critical military and civilian infrastructure, the introduction of ground troops, the assault on Kiev, things of that nature. But it could also be that they will take, smaller steps, but still meaningful, such as the open introduction of Russian troops into the Donbass, leading up to perhaps annexation of that territory, or they might just capture a few more villages along the Ukrainian border in order to then assess what is going to be the Western response. NATO, the United States, have not pledged to defend Ukraine militarily, but have pledged sanctions responses. So that could be everything up to sanctioning every Russian bank, personal sanctions on Putin all the way, President Putin all the way down. It could be sanctioning or kicking Russia out of SWIFT so that no one in Russia can use credit cards. all things that are totally possible, but which the Russians, and of course, I should also mention in the European context, that Nord Stream 2, the oil and gas pipeline that Russians have been looking to secure their medium-term energy export goals into Europe, would also become, at that point, a very expensive paperweight. So all of these things combined suggest that Russia can go the way of conflict in order to see what the West is really going to do, or they could go with just further negotiations and keep the issue of Ukraine, NATO, and their security needs at the top of the international agenda for an indefinite period of time.
Okay, Andrij Dobriansky, you know, Klaus Laris told us earlier on when we look at the issue of Ukrainian membership of NATO, that NATO really has no intention of admitting Ukraine into the alliance, but it cannot agree to that in a legally binding document. And even with all the Western rhetoric about Ukraine and assurances that it can join whichever alliance it wants to join, it is a sovereign nation, even President Biden is not so sure about that. When he was asked about Ukraine joining NATO, he was quoted by the United States state-run broadcaster VOA as saying, and I'm quoting here, he said, "School's out on that question. It remains to be seen." It's hardly a ringing endorsement for membership, is it?
Well, the membership process will actually begin with NATO granting both Georgia and Ukraine the membership action plan, which was promised in 2008 and then reaffirmed at subsequent summits. So it's not an immediate entry into NATO, but a reaffirming of what was promised to Ukraine, which was the membership action plan, as well as reaffirming all the cooperating operations that Ukraine has done since 1996. So for over 25 years, Ukraine has deployed in support of NATO, and that interoperability will only grow within the coming year. And I predict by the end of the year, we'll see a map offered for both Georgia and Ukraine.
Klaus Laures, Russia says that it has legitimate concerns about its security if NATO expansion goes ahead and includes countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and possibly even Finland. That's been mentioned as well. But NATO has ruled out what it calls its core principle, an open door policy. That, you know, the Russians want that policy to be a closed door policy. This is how the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grishko responded. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The dialogue revealed many disagreements on fundamental issues. One of the main issues is that NATO selectively interprets the principle of indivisibility and security. In the NATO's view, it exists only for alliance's members. If NATO opts for the policy of deterring Russia, we will respond with the measures of counter-deterrence. If it uses the policy of intimidation, we will respond with counter-intimidation. If it looks for vulnerabilities in the Russian defense system, we will look for NATO's vulnerabilities. It's not our choice, but we don't have other options if we don't overturn this current very dangerous course of events.
So, Klaus, listening to the tone there, listening to the language used there, the Russians are standing their ground, aren't they?
Oh, they are. They are pretty determined. That is clear. And I think Putin has concluded that the West is weak, that perhaps the Biden administration is weak after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are lots of domestic crises, pandemic crisis in the United States. So that is the moment when the Russians can be tough. That must have been his conclusion, that it is a relatively good period of time. So he is provocative. But the West, of course, cannot give Russia a veto over whether or not to admit new members to NATO. And all countries, essentially all European countries, have the right to apply for NATO membership. But it doesn't mean that NATO has always to grant them admission. And I think in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, it is clear that NATO has no intention to do so. Even in 2008, Germany and France vetoed the Bush administration's push to give that roadmap to NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia. But I think we should also consider whether Putin is really that concerned about the missiles at his border, because he knows that NATO does not want to invade Russia. But isn't he more concerned about the democratic developments in countries such as Ukraine, in Georgia, in Kazakhstan, in Belarus? That is what I think he is really afraid of, that if these countries turn away from that Russian sphere of influence and go grow and become part of the Western sphere of influence, that is eventually that will have an impact on Russia, and that the protest movements in Russia, Navalny and co, will become stronger and will dispute Putin's leadership role. I wonder whether that isn't his real fear, rather than the missiles along the border with Russia, which will never be used to attack Russia. He knows that. Everyone knows that.
Anton, do you agree with that, that the main concern in Russia is possibly over the flourishing of democracy in former Soviet states that surround Russia?
No, I think that's somewhat of a misdirection of what is of concern to Russia. Look, we know how the United States reacted in 1962 when the sovereign state of the USSR, regardless of how you feel about its politics, decided to place medium-range ballistic missiles to the territory of the sovereign state of Cuba, again, regardless of how you feel about Fidel Castro's early policies on the island. Those, by the way, were officially declared to be defensive weapons. There was no intention to attack the United States. They were placed there with the intention of preventing another attempt, such as the Bay of Pigs attempt to get rid of Castro, and the Kennedy administration leapt into action with the overwhelming support of the American population, because the threat to American security was simply something that the United States would not brook so close to its border. So I think that's the emphasis that the Russians are making here. No, the weapons will not be used against Russia immediately. But listen, once the infrastructure is there, the indivisibility of European security is up in the air. On the democratic point, this argument has been made many times. Listen, the state of Ukraine today is far from a healthy, functioning country. Unfortunately, it is the poorest country in Europe, and in large part, what is responsible, or the people responsible for that, are in power now, and Poroshenko, Zelensky's predecessor. By cutting economic ties with Russia, Ukraine has impoverished himself. The president of Ukraine, by decree, has shut down Russian-speaking media outlets, again, regardless of whether you agree with Putin's policies or not. These are not exactly democratic steps. The Russians have no problem with Armenia being a democracy and being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And what happened in Kazakhstan just recently was started out as legitimate complaints, but quickly turned into a violent free-for-all. So that's not an issue about, I think Putin is less concerned about democracy than he is about security.
Yuval Weber, what do you make of that? I mean, big powers do have spheres of interest, don't they, regardless of individual countries having rights of sovereignty, and the big powers will look after their spheres of interest no matter what.
Well, I think those are two different questions there. Do great powers want to project influence over their neighboring states? Certainly, and it's up to those neighboring states to articulate their sovereignty as best as, not just as best as they wish, but how they want to do so. And so I think in the previous comments, when we're talking about what is the threat of a democratic Ukraine, it's not democracy per se, as perhaps Klaus was describing, or totally security, as perhaps Anton was describing, but the idea that Ukraine can choose what it wants to do, regardless of what Putin wants. And that, in essence, is the challenge to Russia and to Putin, and to really Putin's hold on power in Russia itself. And that would be the core thing that would denote the end of the Cold War period from 1989, 1991 to the present, would result in Russia being left with very few states outside of its own borders which are looking to it for leadership. And if the Russian president is unable, whether it's Putin or the next person, is unable to project influence over a country as close as Ukraine, then what does that say about his ability to be a great power? And so in that sense, the demonstration of Ukraine's sovereignty really cuts into Russia's great powerness.
Right.
And that is the core thing that's unacceptable to Putin.
Okay. Anton Fedyashin, the United States delegation to these talks this week has been led by Wendy Sherman. This is her assessment of what has happened so far, and basically she gives her reasons on why she thinks these talks have failed.
If Russia has concerns about its security, which, quite frankly, I heard loud and clear today, but Russia is a big country with vast land territory. They're a permanent member of the Security Council. They have the largest conventional military in Europe. Along with the United States, we are the two largest nuclear powers on Earth. They are a powerful country. The fact that they feel threatened by Ukraine, a smaller and still developing democracy, is hard to understand, quite frankly.
So there's Wendy Sherman there saying the fact that Russia feels it's threatened by Ukraine, a much smaller country, is hard to understand. Is it that hard to understand, Anton?
No, it's not. And listen, everything that Wendy Sherman said applies to the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And it had nothing to fear from tiny little Cuba, because it wasn't Cuba that was the issue. It was missiles and a military infrastructure, 90 miles off the Florida coast. The Russians aren't afraid of Ukraine per se. They are afraid of the infrastructure of a military alliance appearing on their borders. That is the issue, not Ukraine per se.
Okay. I want to get Andrij Dobriansky's view on this. Andrij, isn't Wendy Sherman being a little bit disingenuous there when she says that she can't understand how Ukraine, a smaller country, poses a threat to Russia, when we know that if Ukraine is admitted to NATO, that will allow the United States to put bases in Ukraine. It will allow them to deploy troops in Ukraine. It could establish anything it wants to there. It could carry out exercises in Ukraine if it wants to as well. I mean, that would be the equivalent of Russia putting bases, say, in Tijuana, Mexico, or in Ontario, Canada. It's not as if NATO membership doesn't carry consequences, does it?
Well, I love the proposition of looking back at the Cuba crisis, because Russia, the Soviet Union, a genocidal totalitarian regime that has been condemned rightfully to the bins of history, decided to place nuclear armament in violation of what NATO thought was acceptable. And NATO did not invade, but NATO did what you saw this week. NATO held together. And through diplomacy, Russia and the Soviet Union stepped back from the brink of war because NATO held together. And that's what we saw this week in Europe. You didn't just hear the United States talking. You saw every NATO country talking. And not only were they talking in unison, but they were demanding of Russia to stand in line with the Helsinki Charter, the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. They were asking Russia to remove its troops today from Georgia, from Moldova and Ukraine. So this is really about Russia making a mistake. They were on the road back for another reset, and yet they tried to push their luck.
Andrij, I am sorry we have run out of time. I wish I could give you more time, but time's caught up with us. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.